A mountain meets a desert meets a river meets the trees, you and me. I really know my way around the demons, petty little things they like to sing and dance. You and me. I really know my way around the demons, petty little things they like to sing and dance.
A wall with graffiti, including a large image of eyes in bright colors, a small cartoon face with one eye, and blue tags. In front of the wall is a soccer goal with a red net, partially covering the drawing. There is snow on the ground, creating a bright contrast with the warm tones of the brick wall. Shooting parameters: ISO 100, optimal for minimal noise. Aperture f5, reasonable balance between sharpness and depth of field. Shutter speed 180 sec, may be borderline for handheld shooting at 70 mm. Focal length 70 mm, maximum zoom of the lens. Exposure compensation for 1.7 stops, increases exposure. What could be improved? Overexposure in bright areas. Snow, goal net. Reason: exposure compensation. Plus 1.7 makes the image brighter, but the snow and white details are overexposed. Solution: you can reduce the exposure compensation to 0.7 or leave it at 0 and adjust the exposure in the editor. Shutter speed 180 sec at 70 mm. Problem: at this focal length, the minimum safe shutter speed should be 100 or shorter when shooting handheld. Solution: if you don't have a tripod, it's better to increase the shutter speed to 125 sec/pam. Contrast and sharpness. The photo looks a bit soft, possibly due to the lighting or a little shake. You can slightly increase the contrast and add clarity and sharpness in the editor. Composition. The lamp in the foreground slightly interferes with the perception of the main object. You can try a different shooting angle or blur the background a bit, for example by reducing the f number to f4. Result: the photo is good, but for an ideal result you can reduce the exposure compensation. Use a shutter speed of 100 plus. Adjust the contrast in the editor. According to the text on the plaque, this mural is part of the Sentier de la Bourgogne project, which was carried out by the Coalition de la Petite Bourgogne Quartier en Santé in 2016. The project was funded by the Quartier 21 program, initiated by the City of Montreal and the Le Sud-Ouest Borough, and with the support of the Montreal Municipal Housing Authority, Office Municipal d'Habitation de Montréal. The mural was created by the Art du Common collective, artducommon.com, a group of artists specializing in murals and public art projects. Photo description: graffiti on a brick wall depicting a woman's face with flowing hair. Part of the drawing is painted over with tags and graffiti. The background is bluish, creating a contrast with the dark hair. Red flowers and additional inscriptions are visible at the bottom. The graffiti photo turned out rich and contrasty, but there are a few things that could be improved. 1. Exposure and brightness. The current exposure, for 1.7 EV, made the photo a little overexposed. This is especially noticeable in the highlights, the background and the face on the graffiti. It would be better to use exposure compensation in the range of 0 plus 1 EV to preserve more details in the highlights. 2. Shutter speed, 180 sec/m, is quite sufficient for a static scene, but if you were shooting handheld, some micro-blurring is possible. Recommendation: if there is enough light, you can try 100 or 125 sec/nas for greater sharpness. 3. Aperture, f4.5. Your lens is fast, f2.8, but the aperture was closed to f4.5. If you want a little more sharpness, you can try f5.6. If you want to blur the background more, for example, if the subject was closer, you can open it up to f2.8, f3.5. Focal ISO 100, a great choice for minimal noise. Nothing needs to be changed here. 5. White balance. It seems that the photo is slightly moving towards cold shades, blue, light blue. You can try setting the white balance warmer or adjusting it in post-processing. Result: good settings, but it is better to reduce the exposure compensation. Pub 17 EV is too much. And try changing the aperture a little, f5.6 for sharpness. If you want warmer shades, adjust the white balance. The picture shows a city wall with graffiti. There are two profiles painted on the facade. The upper one is a classic antique head in a helmet, and the lower one is a modern worker in a construction helmet. Under the picture are graffiti tags. Snow on the ground and the lack of foliage on the trees indicate the winter season. The colors of the graffiti contrast with the dark brickwork of the building. Camera, Nikon D7000. Lens, Nikkor 3570mm f2.8. ISO 100 is a low value which is good for reducing noise. Aperture f4.5 allows for a reasonable depth of field. Shutter speed 180 sec is relatively slow for handheld shooting, but probably sufficient due to the lack of movement. Focal length 44mm is an average value, convenient for shooting architecture. Exposure compensation plus 1.7 indicates that the scene was a bit dark and an increase in brightness was required. Stabilization. If this was a handheld shot, it would be better to raise the ISO to 200-400 and reduce the exposure compensation to avoid potential blur. Aperture. You could close it down to f5.6 or f8 for more sharpness and detail on the wall. Focal length 44mm works well, but if the goal is to focus on the details of the graffiti, you could use 70mm for a closer shot. Composition. An interesting option would be to try shooting from a different angle, for example from a lower point, to add dynamism. Editing. Increase the contrast and brightness of the graffiti colors a bit to make them more expressive. Overall, the photo captures the atmosphere of the urban art and architecture well. The image shows colorful graffiti on the wall of a building. The drawing is done in an abstract style with psychedelic elements. The central composition is two intertwined figures surrounded by a stream of flowers and ribbons. The main colors are bright neon shades of pink, yellow, blue, and purple. Smooth blue lines connecting different parts of the wall complement the scene. The frame also contains an urban element, a lamppost and a traffic light with a red signal, which adds context to the street. ISO 160, slightly higher than ISO 100 in the previous image, but still within the low values to reduce noise. Aperture f5.6 provides a slightly larger depth of field. Shutter speed 125 sec, fast enough for handheld shooting, reduces the risk of blur. Focal length 70mm allows you to capture the details of the graffiti closer. Exposure compensation plus 1.7. Brightness correction, most likely due to the dark scene. Tips for improvement: white balance. The photo has a noticeable cold tint. Perhaps the camera has determined the color temperature incorrectly. In post-processing, you can adjust the white balance, adding warm tones, contrast, and saturation. The graffiti is already bright, but you can increase the contrast a little to highlight its details. Composition. If the goal is to highlight the drawing, you could shoot from a different angle or from a different distance to remove unnecessary elements, such as a traffic light. Exposure. Despite the exposure compensation, the shadows in the lower part of the frame look quite dark. You can try lightening them in the editor. Alternative options. Perhaps using a wider aperture, for example f4, would allow you to focus even more on the graffiti, blurring the background. Overall, the photo conveys the street art well, but the white balance distorts the perception of the scene a little. The photo shows a graffiti wall, the central element of which is a brightly painted frog with a paper crown. Around it are fantastic flowers, bugs, demonic faces, and other elements. In front of the wall are parked cars covered in snow. However, the photo has a pronounced blue tint, which distorts the original colors. Reasons for the blue tint: white balance, WB. Probably a non-automatic mode was set, for example, daylight, which is not suitable for night shooting. Air temperature, 10 degrees C. In cold weather, camera sensors may react differently, especially if the battery is cooling down. Overexposure due to exposure compensation, plus 1.7 EV, increasing the brightness could shift the color balance towards cold shades. Reflection of the sky and snow. Snow often gives a cold shade, especially under artificial lighting. Check the white balance. In the raw file, you can set the correct color temperature, and 5500, 6000K. Reduce exposure compensation. Maybe plus 1.7 was too much. Try plus 0.3 or 0. Use ISO 100 to 200. Excessive ISO can affect color rendition. Adjust in the editor. In Photoshop or Lightroom, you can reduce the blue saturation, HSL blue, and adjust the white balance. Summary: most likely the main reason is the white balance and the effect of snow. If the photo was taken in RAW, it will be easy to fix. The photo shows a red brick building with graffiti on the walls. On the entrance wall, there is expressive street art, a man's head with bright contrasting colors. Below the image is an abandoned entrance group. The door is partially boarded up. There is a lot of graffiti and garbage around. There is snow, concrete barriers, and parked cars around the building. The atmosphere of the frame conveys an urban, slightly abandoned style. Possible reasons for the bluish tint. As in the previous photos, a blue tint is noticeable, which can be caused by low temperature, 10 degrees C. The camera sensor could affect the color rendering. White balance. Perhaps the wrong WB is set, for example, daylight instead of automatic or shadow mode. Exposure compensation, plus 1.7. This could lead to lightening of the snow and a change in the color balance. Oversaturation in the camera or post-processing. If a picture style with increased saturation was used, What could have been improved? Adjust white balance, WB. Try setting it to cloudy, or manually adjust the temperature in Kelvin, around 6000 K. Reduce exposure compensation. Pubs 1.7 was probably too much, as the snow additionally brightens the scene. Use ISO 100. In the Parc Saint-Henri in Montreal, there is a fountain with a monument dedicated to Jacques Cartier. This monument was created by the sculptor Joseph Arthur Vincent and erected in 1893. At the top of the monument is a statue of Jacques Cartier, depicting him as a brave explorer, dressed in the fashion of the time of Francis I. His right hand rests on the hilt of a sword, and his left is raised and points to the west. At his feet is the base of a tree trunk, symbolizing undeveloped land. The middle part of the monument is decorated with inscriptions describing episodes from the career of Jacques Cartier. Jacques Cartier, 1491 to 1557, was a French explorer who set out in 1534 to find a westward route to Asia, reached Newfoundland and the coast of Labrador, and then claimed Canada for Francis I. He made 3 voyages in 1534, 1535, and 1541.
This time, kneeling at your feet, it's your waistline till I wet my eyes. Imagine no more.